Hi everyone, God bless you today. It's the Lord's Day and it's Mother's Day, and I want to make a video while I had a few minutes here on something that has been on my mind for a little while. I've thought to myself I should say something about this, and this is addressing the matter that comes up, at least in my life, periodically I guess, where people will say this in one form or another: well, all religions are basically the same. Is that really true? Now, you could go into a long, extended video on this and give a protracted speech involving all the various major elements of different popular religions around the world, but I'd just like to make some observations and give some basic bits and thoughts for consideration. And I'd like to read an excerpt from a book that I thoroughly have enjoyed, and that is G.K. Chesterton, The Everlasting Man. I wouldn't recommend this to most people. It's pretty weighty, but it is an excellent work done many years ago by G.K. Chesterton, and he speaks in one chapter on God and comparative religion, as he calls it. Can I read this to you, and then I'll make some comments after that. G.K. Chesterton writes, and he says, "Comparative religion is comparative indeed. That is, it is so much a matter of degree and distance and difference that it is only comparatively successful when it tries to compare." He's very witty, of course. He goes on and says, "When we come to look at it closely, we find it comparing things that are really quite incomparable. We are accustomed to see a table or catalog of the world's great religions in parallel columns until we fancy they are really parallel. When we're accustomed to see the names of the great religious founders all in a row: Christ, Mohammed, Buddha, Confucius. But in truth, this is only a trick. Another of these optical illusions, by which any objects may be put into a particular relation by shifting to a particular point of sight, those religions and religious founders, or rather those whom we choose to lump together as religions and religious founders, do not really show any common character." Isn't that interesting? "The illusion is partly produced by Islam coming immediately after Christianity in the list, as Islam did come after Christianity and was largely an imitation of Christianity. But the other Eastern religions, or what we call religions, not only do not resemble the church, but do not resemble each other. When we come to Confucianism, at the end of the list, we come to something in a totally different world of thought. To compare the Christian and Confucian religions is like comparing a theist with an English squire, or asking whether a man is a believer in immortality or 100% American. Confucianism may be a civilization, but it is not a religion." And he goes on to say that in truth, the church is too unique to prove herself unique. And he says in this section here that these are false classifications because the church and Christianity are so unique. Again, you can't even call them unique because there's nothing even really to honestly compare them to. Well, what are we to make of his claims here? He's saying that this is an optical illusion to line up all of these various religions and these great teachers of the past and call them virtually identical or the same, or this of the same stuff. Can we do that? He says, no, that's an optical illusion. That's a trend of thought that just cannot carry weight. Well, let me say, here is why in some ways people tend to say that we have justification for saying that these different religions are religions and are equally valid in the eyes of some? Well, they all have a concept of divinity, and I'm looking at some notes I jotted to myself here. They all have some kind of concept of divinity or divinities, right? And there are sacred texts, and they go to these sacred texts, and whatever that might be. For the Muslim, it's the Quran. For the Christian, it's the Bible, and so forth. They have their various forms of worship and practices. That's true, obviously, in most all these religions. And there's only, by the way, about 7 or 8 major religions. There's some form of priesthood, religious order of some kind, right? We have the leaders in that particular faith. And worship places, whether it be a synagogue or it be a church or it be a temple, whatever it might be. There's these places of worship. And they all teach essentially the same thing, that you should be a good person, you should love one another, do unto others, that sort of thing. And they generally have some kind of idea of eternity and an eternal abode, don't they? So goes the argument, etc., etc. Here's some things I would throw at the discussion here. First of all, when we talk about God, well, we all believe in some kind of deity, and it really doesn't matter. You know, you see the mountain from one angle, I see the mountain from another. That's an old argument, old illustration. But how do we know we're looking at the same mountain? Are we looking at the same mountain? Well, the illusion, as it goes, is you think you're looking at different mountains, but really it's the same mountain. It's just the same God, and he just has different names. Whether you call him Allah or Jesus, it's really irrelevant, because they're all pointing to the same deity, which is really ineffable or indescribable or beyond all these categorizations. Are we talking about one God? You see, there's monotheism, which is the belief in one deity. The Islamic faith, Judaism, Christianity believe in one God. Not all faiths do. So are we talking about one God, or multiple gods, or God's changing forms of some sort? What are we talking about when we talk about God? And salvation, is it essentially the same for all? Do good? No, not in Christianity. Most religions are religions of works, doing certain things to gain the approval of some deity, to follow a certain path, whatever it might be. It is essentially something where work is expected of you in order to gain a place in some kind of eternal bliss. But then not all religions even have such a picture of eternity. Whereas Christianity, though, on the other hand, talks about grace. Paul said, we're not saved by works, but by grace, through faith. It's a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast, he says. What about the problem of suffering? Well, Buddhism teaches that suffering is inevitable, and the reason for the suffering is desire, and the key is to extinguish the desire. Remove the desire, you remove the suffering. Christianity comes at suffering altogether differently. What about peace and war and conflict? The Christian religion will defend a justified self-defense, but Jesus says if you pick up the sword and live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Islam is a very militant religion. It even promotes jihad, and so it comes at the whole matter of military conflict from a different point of view. The symbol of Christianity is a cross. The symbol of Islam is a sword. What about the practices? They're all the same, aren't they? Are they? There are some very bizarre practices in Hinduism that date back for many thousands of years, and we would call them vile and disgusting in certain cases, and I won't go into descriptions of these. But some are what we would call reprehensible. Are they all equally valid? Are they all equally good? We say it's not right to let cows roam through the streets and defecate. They say these are forms of deity. Is it all of equal validity? What about the central figures? What can we make of them? Is Jesus Christ just like Muhammad? Just like Gautama Buddha? Are they all the same? Confucius? Are they all the same? Not at all. All you have to do is, again, just read a little bit about these characters. Some, you even question their historical validity and whether much of what is said about them is even legendary. Is that true? Are they all equally historically verifiable? No, they're not. The historical weight of their persons, the historical weight of their teachings, what are we to make of it? What about that leads to, again, the texts? Aren't all sacred texts of equal validity? No, not necessarily at all. Not necessarily at all. Some come from Islam, essentially came in a series of visions through one man. The Bible is composed over roughly 1,500 years through multiple men, and then eventually combined and put together in a text, a single text. What about claims to divinity? Did all claim to be divine? No, not necessarily at all. What about eyewitnesses again, verifications of these accounts? Again, historicity, statements, prophetic utterances. Can others claim to have the substantiation of their prophetic statements like Christianity? Many, many prophecies have been fulfilled that were predicted in the Old Testament, already in the New. What about the resurrection? Christianity claims to have a living leader. Can we say that about the other major religions of the world? Is Moses alive? Buddha? Muhammad? As far as we know, the tomb is still empty. Obviously, I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, and you know where I stand. Then there's the claims of Christ himself. Jesus claimed to be divine. Oh, he never said that directly. He said it, if you're listening. He said, before Abraham was, I am. Clear reference to Exodus 3, where, if you remember, Moses was at the burning bush. Who shall I say will send me? I am. I am that I am. Yahweh. Jesus was saying, before Abraham was. Abraham lived historically 4,000 years ago. Jesus is, I was alive before Abraham. John said, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, well, when was that? That's, again, a tie-in with Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When was that? Beyond our time. Jesus claimed to be God. They criticized him for wanting to heal someone. He says, what? And for forgiving someone. And he says, well, which is more difficult, to heal or to forgive? But that you may know that, again, the Son of Man is who he says he is. You know, be healed. But he forgave the man his sins. And again, they didn't accept that. Why did they ultimately nail him to a cross? It says right in the gospel accounts, because he claimed to be divine. Jesus claimed deity. He had eyewitnesses to his miraculous activities. These are all recorded. The ones that we have are recorded in Scripture. Why did the church begin? Why did people allow themselves to be tortured and killed for someone who was less than who he claimed to be? Obviously, they believed it. One thing, too, we don't realize is how close in time the gospel accounts were formulated. And you will hear this, and I hear this continuously online, people claiming that the scriptures were not even put together and even in operation until the 4th century. And that is absolutely historically nonsensical. These documents that we have, the New Testament letters and the New Testament books, were all compiled and even in circulation by the end of the 1st century. 1 Thessalonians could easily have been written within 20 to 25 years after the crucifixion. You don't realize this. In terms of literature and time frames, that is basically a blink of the eye. Much of Paul's writings were in the 50s, and perhaps the very latest writings, for example, Revelation and even John's Gospel, more towards the end of the 1st century, maybe even the last decade of the 1st century. But they were already recognized as scriptural and in circulation. They weren't fully compiled as a corpus, but they were, again, being circulated. Again, strongly grounded in history, strongly grounded in the activities of the 1st century and in the Roman world. Can we say this about other religions? Can we make such strong claims of historicity and even just the general truthfulness and the practicality of the teachings of the Bible, how true and how sound they are? The Quran doesn't read the same. That's another thing too, when you begin to just briefly examine, again, the main texts of other religions, you realize that these don't even begin to read in the same fashion. They sound very fantastical and very highly imaginative in some ways, and not at all like you will find in much of the scriptures themselves. Sounds like a defense for Christianity. I suppose it is. But I'm simply arguing this, simply saying this, just throwing it out for your consideration, that we need to be a little slow to say these are all essentially the same, they're all essentially teaching the same thing. They are not. They are not. If I look around and I see a tree right in front of me, about 25 feet in front of me here, I could say, well, there's a tree, and then over there I look and I see a squirrel running in the yard next to me, and I say, see, they're all essentially the same. They're all things. They're all here. They're not the same at all. They are objects. They appear to be living, but they're entirely different. For me to say that, well, because I see it and because it's presented to me and because I can consider it and because I can point to certain commonalities, they're both alive, they're both proximate to my location, therefore they're essentially the same. That is just foolishness. Things are what they are, and things are not what they're not. Be a little slower, is what I'm saying, and jumping to conclusions and assuming that all teachings are equally valid and that all point in the same direction. Jesus said, no, they do not. Again, let me close with one quote from Jesus. in Mark 14, or John 14 rather. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. I am the way. So, blessings to you. I welcome your comments, your likes, dislikes, all that kind of thing. And if you would, pass it on for someone else, would you please? Thank you.